Hello, folks. I apologize for our technical difficulties on Tuesday, but we need to get through our nervous system first couple of sections. So we'll get going here and make a quick run through of neurons and the parts of the brain. All right, so to begin, we need to talk about just the brain. The whole nervous system is made up of neural tissue, and basically the brain, spinal cord, all this spinal nerves and cranial nerves that run out to the body and bring information back are all made up of two structures that are called either neurons or neuroglia. Neurons are the functional unit that actually transmit the electricity and the electrical impulses, from our brain and spinal cord out to our body and back. And that's basically how our body works, is just by transmitting that electrical impulse that allows all the changes and adjustments and allow us to react to our environment. Now, with neurons, we're talking about 100 billion neurons in the body, but then when we talk about neuroglia, it's about 10 times that amount. And neuroglia cells, there's many different types of them that I'll show you a picture of later, but they are supporting cells that basically separate and protect, and they can give structure and form to the different neurological structures. But then they also can be phagocytic, and when cells need to die or become damaged, the neuroglia will destroy those cells. And then in addition to neurons and neuroglia, we also have a lot of blood flow to that and other connective tissue. There's actually a lot of fatty material. Your nervous system is actually one of the highest fat contents of all the areas of the body. When we break the nervous system down, it breaks down into two systems, the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system, or what we call the CNS and the PNS. The central nervous system is kind of our core nervous system, the brain and spinal cord, what keeps us alive. It takes in information from the body, it processes that information in the brain and sends out an appropriate response and a reaction to it. The peripheral nervous system are all the nerves that run out from the brain and the spinal cord out to the body, and then the nerves that come back that are called motor neurons and sensory neurons. Motor neurons send reactions out, sensory neurons bring information in, but that is all part of the peripheral nervous system. One thing we know is that the central nervous system is a little more fragile. When it's damaged, we do not get those cells back. So brain or spinal cord injury typically is permanent, where peripheral nervous system, the cranial and spinal nerves, do have a little more ability to repair or find a new pathway to areas. So sometimes, if you say sever a finger, you can get functionality back to that because it will either repair itself or find a new pathway there. We also break the nervous system down into two groups called somatic and autonomic. Somatic nervous system is anything that we control. So when you walk and talk and move and write and type on your computer, that's all things you can control or somatic. The autonomic stuff is like breathing and heart rate and digestion, things we can't control. And there it's divided into two categories depending on what your emotional state is. If it's sympathetic, then you tend to be either angry or scared or excited, and your metabolism tends to speed up in most systems other than digestion, which does the opposite. Parasympathetic, things tend to slow down in our body when we're relaxed, except for digestion. Again, that it actually works better when we're relaxed, and everything else slows down. So here we see a couple of different flow charts in a row here. So our central nervous system of the brain and spinal cord, the peripheral nervous system and the cranial and spinal nerves break down into sensory neurons that come into the body or come into the brain, and motor neurons that go out from the brain to the body to cause a reaction. The autonomic nervous system, which we can't control, which is broken down into sympathetic when you're excited or parasympathetic when you're relaxed, and then the somatic, which is the one that we can control. Another breakdown showing the same thing on that slide. Here are just some reactions that you tend to see happening when those sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems are activated. And what we tend to see is that, our bronchi relax, which means they get bigger so we can breathe faster and get more air in. When our heart rate increases, digestion tends to slow down, but we do burn up more sugar during that time. And we tend to find things like salivation, and you get cotton mouth when you're excited, but when you're relaxed, you tend to drool a lot. And everything else slows down, but digestion increases. All right, so then we get to the axon, and this is kind of the neuron, and the main part of the nervous system is this structure. This is the functional unit, and in a neuron, you always have three parts. You have this area that's called the cell body that contains the nucleus, so this is kind of controlling that cell. Then we have a long whip-like tail that's called the axon, and that transmits the electrical impulse from the cell body down to a terminal on this end that will either connect to a structure or to another neuron. On the axon, you always see this stuff that's called myelin, and myelin is a fatty covering over the axon that actually basically insulates it so that we don't lose any of that electrical current. And there's a lot of disorders where that myelin breaks down or never forms. They kind of form little hot dog looking bundles called Schwann cells, and then there's little gaps in between that can be connection areas for other neurons that are called nodes of Ranvier. We have a lot of dendrites, a lot of little tree-like extensions that are picking up on impulses and picking up stimuli that are also found on that neuron. Here, when we look at other forms here, these are the other neuroglia. So we see astrocytes, microglia, and all these other cells, oligodendrocytes. These I don't care that you know so much, but just know there's a lot of different structures. And when some of them separate, some of them protect, some of them are phagocytic, but they all kind of do a different job. But this is all considered to be neuroglia type cells here, where this was the actual neuron. All right, so we talked about these cell parts. Cell body contains the nucleus and kind of takes in the information and analyzes it. The axon is the part that transmits the electrical stimulus. The dendrites pick up little are little extensions that pick up on stimuli, and then where the terminals come in and meet a structure, whether it's a muscle fiber, a gland, another neuron, there's a gap between those two neurons where that's called the synapse. And we talked about that in muscle contraction, that you have that area, and you need to have these things called neurotransmitters. We talked about ACH in the muscle, but neurotransmitters that allow the electrical impulse to jump over that gap, and that's what kind of allows us to control certain activities and start them or stop them. Now, if it's a neuromuscular junction, obviously it's connecting to a muscle. If it's a neuroglandular junction, it's connecting to a gland that's telling it to either not release or to release extra hormone at that time. So here you see a shot of the axon coming down and the terminal here, and then that connection area. This would be like a neuromuscular junction at that point. Here's another neuromuscular junction or neuroglandular junction, but this little gap in here is the synapse, and basically what the impulse will come down, and that will cause the neurotransmitter to be released in the gap, which will allow the change of current, what we call depolarization, repolarization, which we'll get into later, but the movement of ions into and out of that cell membrane, whatever it's connecting to. All right, neurons, basically three types of neurons that we have that transmit that electrical impulse. Sensory, like we said, takes impulses in and brings it from the sense organs, whether it's the eyes, the nose, your sense of touch, feel, any of that stuff, and brings it to the brain. The motor neurons are what connect out to muscles and glands and other structures that go out to the body. And then there are neurons that connect one neuron to another, which are just called interneurons. So three different types of neurons out there. Again, here you see this is that connection area of one neuron to another. So if we have a string of these neurons all together, then we'd have an interneuron in between those. When we talk about just general terms, the nerve is just a bundle of neurons that are connected together. So when you actually look and you dissect like a body part, like a forearm, and you're looking at nerves that are running out to the hand, you actually have multiple neurons connected together to be able to see a nerve. Neurons can be up to 3 feet long in some of the body parts, like in the leg, but they're really, really fine, and you wouldn't be able to see them very well without a microscope. But when they're bundled together, you can start to see those white bands running through the body. There's another term called threshold stimulus. In order to allow the release of a neurotransmitter, we have to have enough electrical impulse to reach the synapse to cause the release of the neurotransmitter, and that amount of electricity is called the threshold stimulus. Once that amount of electricity has been reached, the neurotransmitter gets released at the synapse, and then that impulse can jump, and that obviously happens very quickly to allow us to respond in a very fast manner. All right, so here we see again that synaptic space that's in here, and the neurotransmitters getting released when the action potential gets high enough. So when enough electrical current comes down, these ports open up, the neurotransmitter gets released, and then the electrolytes can be transmitted into the next one and allow that impulse to be transmitted. The second part we need to talk about today is just the parts of the central nervous system, so really talking about the brain and the spinal cord. And before we even get to that, if you're cutting into the skull, you would cut through the hard bone of the skull and you would get to an area called the meninges. There are three little protective layers that we'll show you in a second that are called the arachno mater, the dura mater, and the pia mater, that are just three little protective coverings of the brain and spinal cord. And they house a fluid that acts as a little water protector around around the brain and spinal cord that's called cerebrospinal fluid. Um, we know the brain is made up of about 100 billion neurons, and we have 10 times that amount of neuroglia in there also. And that ends up, when you put all that stuff together, we end up getting about 3 pounds of weight or whatever of the overall brain. When we break the brain down, there's the two upper portions of the brain that are the kind of the foldy masses that you see that are in two hemispheres or two halves is called the cerebrum, and there's four parts that make that up: the frontal, parietal, temporal, and occipital. So if I jump to this diagram, you see that here's the frontal. This is a little distorted, but the frontal lobe that's mainly in charge of your memory and kind of your personality, and then we have the temporal lobe that's more mainly in charge of hearing, the occipital lobe and back of the brain that is in charge of sight, and then the parietal lobe right here that has a lot of our sensory functions and our sensory control and other functions are in there. If I jump back here a couple slides here, you see that protective covering. So here's the bone of the skull, and then we see the outer dura mater, and then we see the arachnoid layer, arachnomater, that looks like spider webs, and that's where the arachnophobia is fear of spiders. Arachnoid layer looks like a spider web. And then the pia mater is the protective covering that directly covers the brain and spinal cord. And in between these layers, we have fluid, and that fluid acts as a little cushion. But everybody's heard about concussions, where the brain will hit the side of the skull because those arachnoid layers aren't thick enough, and we'll have a swelling of that tissue over that fluid, and it squeezes on the brain and causes concussion syndrome. Same shot here, just kind of looking at some of those different structures. When we look at parts of the brain again here, now specific functions of the brain, we see that your olfactory sense is right here on the bottom of that frontal lobe. Kind of on the side of the frontal lobe is your speech, called the Broca's area. And then our hearing area is right along this side part of the temporal lobe. Motor control kind of runs in this light blue band, and then touch and pressure receptors are kind of right through there in that parietal lobe. And we get to the back and we start to see vision in the back, and our ability to read and interpret language is a little bit of a cross of hearing and seeing. And then body awareness is also located in there. And then we have a little area for taste also, so you can kind of see where different parts of your brain control certain functions of your brain. So here again, frontal lobe here, temporal lobe in orange, parietal lobe is kind of all of this area, but there's a very specific sensory part here and a motor part, which means it's controlling your body movement that we can control in there, and then the visual part here. And then the last part down here on the bottom is called the cerebellum. The cerebellum is what gives you your coordination and your balance. And then down here we get into the actual spinal cord, or the brain stem, which has your medulla oblongata and this little bump that's called the pons, that are this is kind of your fight or flight part that keeps you alive, and then this is kind of your relaxed body involuntary actions in there. All right, another slide, you can just kind of take a look at this. It's kind of just broken down and shows you some of those different functions along the outside edge. This does the same thing in that motor control area and that sensory motor control area in here. This is just kind of showing you where a lot of those nerves are, and you can see that in your face you have a lot of nerves, and a lot of that part of the brain is dedicated to structures that are in the face and mouth, and also with the hands and feet. Just our main sensory areas are devoted to those different parts of that brain, but you can kind of see as you go along there, we have a little bit of a brain map to figure out where different structures are controlled. Okay, then we get into some major brain parts. The cerebellum, like I said, is that little cauliflower looking thing on the back of your brain that controls your balance and also controls just coordination, things like that. You have a hypothalamus in the center of your brain that's really your kind of your main drive center. It controls thirst and hunger, sexual function, your body temperature, your anger and rage is all controlled by the hypothalamus. And in addition to that, you guys know the hypothalamus is a gland that also controls, it's kind of the regulatory center for a lot of your hormones. And then we have the thalamus, which is on top of the hypothalamus, that's just a relay center that connects the brain and the spinal cord together. So that information that's coming in from the body and from the spinal spinal cord goes through the thalamus, and then the thalamus determines kind of what it's going to do with that. The brain stem down at the bottom, which is mainly the medulla and the pons. This is all your involuntary actions like breathing and heart rate, blood pressure, swallowing, and that's all found here along that brain stem. And like I said, medulla oblongata is your fight or flight. The pons tends to be a little more when you're relaxed. We get in and we see that hypothalamus area here and the thalamus area on top of that. The cerebellum is your balance and coordination area. Your cerebrum is all your voluntary actions, whether it's memory or whether it's touch and control or hearing or occipital in the back. And then the other structure that I want to show you is this little kind of half moon looking structure in here. The hemispheres of the cerebrum are separated, but they are connected together so they can communicate back and forth by this tissue right here that's called the corpus callosum. And that just allows the right side of your brain to communicate with the left side of your brain and information to run back and forth. Most of you know that the right cerebrum controls the left side of your body and the left cerebrum controls the right side of your body. But this is what connects those two so that information can get passed. So that's kind of what we just talked about there. Spinal cord just is a link between the brain and all those body parts. And then when we have a reflex, like I mentioned earlier, it's just an impulse that goes from the body to the spinal cord, and then directly back to the body part. And then it goes to the brain at a later point so we can figure out. But lots of times if somebody drives up behind you and honks a horn and scares you, you react first and then you analyze second. And it's just a way for you to stay alive. All right, here it just gets into some of the cranial nerves that are in the body. Numerous different things, olfactory nerves, and I'm not going to expect you to know these, but olfactory, this is your sense of smell. We have some optic nerves for vision. Oculomotor is moving your eyes. Then we get down into some trigeminal, which are some facial nerves that allow us to make facial expressions. Auditory to the ear. Glossopharyngeal is kind of our tongue and swallowing ability. Same with hypoglossal in there. So you have about 13 of these cranial nerves total that allow our different functions to happen within our head of our body. And then we have a whole bunch of spinal nerves that run out to the body that allow us to connect to all the other areas below the head. Let's see, and then we're getting into the senses, so I'm going to shut it down there and stop at that point. The only thing